Welcome to a tale of power, pride, and an unexpected gift so stunning it silences an entire room. In this dramatic story, a self-obsessed millionaire demands a waitress sing a song only to mock her in front of everyone. Little does he know, his cruel taunt will unlock a voice that leaves the audience speechless and ignites a turn of events he never saw coming. From bitter rivalries to secret dreams, broken hearts to astonishing breakthroughs, each moment builds toward a grand crescendo that flips the script in the most unexpected way. Get ready for a roller coaster of drama, twists, and the sweet taste of karmic justice. It was a brisk Saturday evening in late autumn when the wheels of fate began to turn. At the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, the grand lobby bustled with guests dressed in opulent attire, their conversations blending into a refined hum. Chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, and the faint scent of roses drifted through the air from a centerpiece arrangement that towered elegantly by the reception desk. Wealthy patrons, celebrities, and business tycoons flocked here for their usual indulgences, forming a tapestry of affluence and ambition. Among them was Lance Westwood, a self-made millionaire with a taste for extravagance that matched his towering ego. At only 35, Lance had amassed significant wealth through high-stakes real estate deals and luxury resort developments in exotic destinations. But his arrogance was almost as infamous as his success. Wherever he went, people whispered rumors of his lavish lifestyle, his merciless business tactics, and his penchant for humiliating those he deemed beneath him. That evening, Lance was scheduled to host an extravagant dinner in the hotel's Michelin-starred restaurant. As the staff nervously prepared for his arrival, knowing well his reputation for being difficult, a young waitress named Maribel Flores stepped onto the stage of fate. She was new, barely a month into her job, and had never encountered a guest quite like Lance Westwood. Little did she know that the trajectory of her life would be forever altered by the events about to unfold under the hotel's glittering chandeliers. Maribel had lived in New York for 2 years, struggling to make her way through day jobs and night shifts while quietly pursuing her dream of becoming a singer. She had a voice that could move mountains, a rich contralto that echoed with the depth of her experiences. Yet the city was crowded with aspiring artists, and the competition was fierce. Fearful of rejection, she had never performed for more than a few friends at small, open mic nights. But each time she sang, the audience would grow silent and still, as though entranced by a magic spell. That Saturday evening, Maribel arrived for her shift with her usual sense of professionalism. She didn't particularly enjoy her waiter's uniform. It was stiff and dull, but she wore it with pride because it allowed her to pay rent and keep her modest apartment in Queens. Her mother, who lived in a small town in Mexico, depended on Maribel's monthly wire transfers to cover essential medical bills. Unbeknownst to her, Lance Westwood was about to turn her world upside down. For him, the dinner was a trifling affair, just another opportunity to show off his wealth to potential investors and hangers-on. He had come armed with his smartphone, checking the stock market every few seconds, and chatting with his entourage about the next big deal. Even before he entered the restaurant, rumors of his arrival spread among the staff like wildfire, causing tension to spike. In the midst of this whirlwind, Maribel took a deep breath and prepared herself for the long night ahead. Lance Westwood swept into the restaurant with all the flair of a Hollywood star. Dressed in a meticulously tailored suit by Tom Ford, he exuded confidence. The maitre d' greeted him with a flourish, leading Lance and his party of 6 to the finest table in the room, a large round table draped in crisp white linen, adorned with flickering votive candles. Expensive wine glasses and polished silverware caught the glow of the candlelight. The atmosphere around them shifted. Other patrons recognized Lance or sensed his importance, and soon a hush fell over the adjacent tables. Maribel saw him before he saw her. She noticed his carefully styled hair, the diamond-studded watch on his wrist, and the dismissive way he nodded at the staff. His voice carried through the restaurant, arrogant yet practiced, like a man who was used to being both admired and feared. As Maribel approached the table to pour water, Lance hardly acknowledged her presence. He was busy bragging about a newly acquired piece of land in the Caribbean that he planned to convert into a luxury resort. "Bought it for a steal," he boasted to his companions. "In 6 months, it'll be worth triple." A few of them chuckled politely, raising glasses of chilled champagne in a toast to his triumph. Maribel set down the water pitcher gently. "Welcome to the Waldorf Astoria," she said in her polite, soft-spoken manner. "My name is Maribel, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you off with anything to drink?" Lance turned to her lazily, his eyes raking over her uniform. "Bring us the best wine you have," he ordered, "and don't keep us waiting." Throughout the evening, Maribel maintained her composure, expertly balancing multiple tasks. She took orders, served drinks, offered recommendations, and deftly handled the tension that hovered around Lance Westwood's table like a cloud full of rain. She heard snatches of conversation, discussions about foreign investments, tales of extravagant parties, and boasts of private jet flights. Each story seemed designed to elevate Lance's status further in the eyes of his entourage. But behind the veneer of confidence, Lance carried a restlessness in his eyes. His phone kept buzzing, and every few minutes he would scowl at the screen. Though he tried to hide it from his companions, it was clear something was amiss. Maribel, ever observant, caught sight of the tension in his body. He was tapping his foot impatiently, sneaking glances at his watch as though time were slipping through his fingers. When the main course arrived, an array of decadent dishes, including seared foie gras and aged Wagyu steaks, Lance hardly touched his food. Instead, he kept drinking glass after glass of the finest Bordeaux the hotel's cellar had to offer. Even the sycophantic laughter of his companions began to irritate him, and he snapped at a young investor for making an offhand joke. Maribel felt the atmosphere around the table curdle. She sensed that Lance was a man looking to discharge some pent-up frustration, and she instinctively dreaded the idea that she might become his target. She cleared plates quietly, hoping to remain invisible, yet fate would not permit such anonymity for long. As the dessert course neared, Lance leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine while wearing a predatory half-smile. He spotted Maribel passing by with a tray of creme brulee for another table. Something in his mind clicked, an idea brewed, spurred by alcohol and a desire to amuse himself at someone else's expense. "Waitress!" Lance called out, snapping his fingers. Maribel froze. He beckoned her over with a crooked finger, like one might summon a servant in a medieval court. The entire table went silent as she approached, tension cracking the air. "Yes, sir?" she asked quietly, maintaining her polite tone, even though the gesture irritated her. She could practically feel the eyes of Lance's entourage on her, some of them smirking, others uncertain about what was about to happen. "Everyone here is so serious," Lance drawled, exaggerating a feigned boredom. "I need some entertainment. Don't you have a little show you can put on for us? Maybe sing us a song." "I heard this hotel sometimes has a lounge singer, but tonight it seems we're short on music." He set his wine glass down with a definitive thud. Maribel felt her stomach clench. Yes, she could sing, but being forced to do so on the spot, in front of a table that was clearly looking to mock her, was humiliating. She glanced around, hoping the maître d'œuvre or someone else from management might intervene. Instead, she saw them observing from a distance, uncertain of how to handle the situation without inciting Lance's wrath. Maribel swallowed hard. For a moment she considered politely declining the request, yet in the back of her mind she knew how precarious her job was. The restaurant desperately wanted to keep Lance Westwood happy. Losing a high-profile client like him could mean trouble. Her manager had repeatedly stressed that no staff member should do anything to upset wealthy patrons. And wealthy didn't even begin to describe Lance Westwood. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the tray of desserts. She took a deep breath, recalling the small open mic stages where she had mustered the courage to perform. But this was different. The environment here was far more hostile. This wasn't about appreciation or artistry. Lance wanted to make a spectacle of her, something for him and his cronies to laugh at. "All right," she finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it will please you." Lance smirked, leaning forward as though anticipating a comedic display. "Oh, I'm sure it'll be quite entertaining," he said, glancing around the table to ensure everyone was paying attention. Maribel looked at the guests seated around the restaurant. Some had turned in their chairs, curious about what was about to happen. Others pretended not to notice, their gazes lingering discreetly. She felt her cheeks flush with a mix of anxiety and anger. But then a quiet resolve surfaced. If she was going to sing, she would give it everything she had, because singing was her dream, her passion, and no one would take that from her. She stood at the edge of Lance's table, clasping her hands in front of her. The restaurant's hum seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet hush. Her eyes flicked toward the far wall, where a grand piano rested, unoccupied. In that moment, she wished she had an accompanying instrument, but she knew there was no time to ask. If she stalled any longer, Lance might grow impatient, and the situation would worsen. Maribel closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let her breath settle. She thought of her mother, whose lullabies had once lulled her to sleep on hot summer nights in Mexico. She remembered how the music used to bring comfort and hope, even when money was scarce. In the silence that followed, she summoned a song from her heart, a classic jazz standard that had always resonated with her soul, Summertime from Porgy and Bess. It wasn't the most current tune, but it held a timeless elegance. She began softly, her contralto voice low and mellow, as though it were gently massaging the words. "Summertime, and the livin' is easy." The note danced through the air, surprising even those who had expected something awkward or off-key. A stunned stillness took hold of the room. Maribel's voice slowly rose, building momentum and depth. Each phrase was laced with raw emotion, as though the hopes and dreams bottled within her were finally breaking free. At Lance's table, jaws dropped. They had expected a joke, but what they received was an unforgettable performance. Within seconds, the entire restaurant seemed to still. Plates and utensils paused in mid-action. Conversations halted, as if someone had pressed a universal mute button. Maribel's voice carried far beyond Lance's table, reaching every corner. The resonant timbre of her vocals was breathtaking, velvety and rich, tinged with a profound longing that commanded attention. As she continued, her confidence grew. She no longer felt the sting of Lance's mocking gaze. Instead, she became lost in the music, weaving each note with passion and sincerity. The moment felt surreal, as though the fine dining tables and opulent setting had transformed into a grand stage. Unknowingly, Maribel had captured every soul in that room, transporting them to a place where art transcended social boundaries and power dynamics. Lance, initially poised with a smug grin, found himself incapable of laughter. The cynical remark he'd been ready to hurl remained frozen on his lips. Something in her voice stirred him in a way he wasn't prepared for, reminding him of a distant memory, perhaps from a time when he had less and felt more. By the time she reached the last haunting note of the song, Maribel's eyes were wet with emotion. The final syllable hung in the air like a shimmering promise, reverberating through the silent hall. She stood there, breathless, the world around her momentarily suspended in wonder. For a few astonishing heartbeats, No one moved. And then a thunderous applause exploded, first from a single patron at a far table, then from every person present. For several moments, Maribel was overwhelmed by the standing ovation erupting around her. Wait staff and guests alike clapped until their hands stung. A few even whistled, cheering her on. Only Lance Westwood remained seated, a conflicted expression etched across his face. His entourage exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they should applaud or follow their leader's cue. Maribel dipped her head in a humble bow, trying to blink away tears of relief. She had taken a massive leap of faith, bearing her soul in a place and time meant to embarrass her. Yet she had triumphed, and the wave of approval washing over her felt like a dream. Nearby, the manager of the Waldorf Astoria's restaurant approached, eyes shining with admiration. "That was incredible," he said, momentarily at a loss for words. "I had no idea you could sing like that." "We'll talk later about—" "Well, we'll talk," he stammered, clearly impressed and eager to harness Maribel's hidden talent for the restaurant's benefit. Finally, Maribel turned back to Lance. His face was flushed, not from applause, but from a swirl of emotions he couldn't fully process. She could see the gears in his mind turning. He wanted to regain control of the situation, to reassert his dominance, but for once, words failed him. In the hush that followed the ovation, it was clear that Maribel had won this battle of wills, whether or not she ever intended it to be a confrontation in the first place. As the applause died down, Lance's entourage tried to salvage the mood, congratulating Maribel with forced smiles. One of them, a woman with glittering diamond earrings, awkwardly complimented her. That was quite unexpected, a real hidden gem. Another, a young investment banker, tried to lighten the tension by adding, "I guess we got more than we bargained for tonight." Lance remained silent, staring at Maribel as though she were an equation he couldn't solve. After a few beats, he forced a short, polite clap, just enough to avoid appearing openly disgruntled. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile, but it resembled more of a grimace. Feeling a surge of courage, Maribel gently placed a dessert spoon beside Lance's plate and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Thank you for allowing me to sing, Mr. Westwood. I hope it was entertaining." The subtle emphasis on entertaining was a quiet jab at his earlier intention to make her a spectacle. Lance drained the last of his wine in a single gulp. "Yes. Well," he began, clearing his throat uncomfortably. His eyes darted away for a moment. "That'll be all," he finally said, dismissing her. His companions followed suit, trying to bury their collective embarrassment by pivoting to safer conversation. Topics anything from real estate trends to the next big tech IPO. Yet, the energy at their table had irrevocably shifted. For the remainder of the night, Lance seemed distant, occasionally glaring at Maribel from under lowered brows. After the restaurant had mostly emptied and Maribel was finishing her shift, she found herself summoned to the manager's office. She walked in with a sense of dread and excitement, unsure if she was about to be reprimanded for stealing the spotlight or congratulated for the same reason. The manager, a middle-aged man named Graham Porter, sat behind his large mahogany desk, fiddling with a fountain pen. "Maribel," he began softly, removing his glasses and pressing the bridge of his nose. "I must say, that was some performance. I've been working here for over a decade, and rarely have I seen a diner response like that." Maribel braced herself. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. I'm sorry if I stepped out of line." "Mr. Westwood, forget about Westwood," Porter said, cutting her off. "I couldn't care less about his opinion right now. What I care about is the wave of compliments we've received from other guests. They were all raving about your singing. Some even asked if you'd be performing again." A flicker of hope stirred in Maribel's chest. She clasped her hands together, almost not daring to believe. Porter leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with what looked like genuine admiration. "I've spoken to the hotel's entertainment coordinator. We're looking to add a lounge singer for weekend evenings. Someone classy with real talent. I think you'd be perfect for it. Of course, you can still do your regular shifts, but you'd have an opportunity to sing on select nights." "Are you interested?" Maribel's heart soared. She had moved to New York City chasing a dream, yet found herself bogged down in menial jobs just to survive. Now, out of nowhere, an opportunity had fallen into her lap, albeit under bizarre and humiliating circumstances. She tried to control her excitement, but a bright smile found its way onto her face nonetheless. I would love that, Mr. Porter. Thank you. I'll do my best to meet the hotel standards, she said, her voice tremulous with gratitude. Porter nodded, returning her smile with one of his own. "You'll need to audition officially, of course. Hotel policy. But consider it a formality at this point. I'll be in touch with the details." She walked out of the office, feeling as though she were floating. The adrenaline from the night's events still pulsed through her veins, but now it was tinged with anticipation. She clutched her phone, already planning to call her mother and share the unexpected good news. However, the evening still had one more twist in store for her. Just as Maribel reached the staff exit, she spotted Lance Westwood standing near the reception desk, arguing heatedly with someone on his phone. His face was a mask of anger, and his voice carried across the lobby, "I don't care if the market's down, I need that deal closed, or heads will roll." He slammed the phone into his pocket, muttering curses under his breath. Unseen by him, Maribel slipped out quietly into the crisp night air, wondering if their paths would ever cross again. The following week was a whirlwind for Maribel. She prepared diligently for her official audition at the Waldorf Astoria. Every spare moment after her shifts was spent practicing scales, polishing her repertoire, and imagining the potential future that might await her as a lounge singer. The thought of regular performances filled her with both exhilaration and dread. Exhilaration because it was the first step toward her true ambition, dread because she feared failing in front of a more formal panel. Meanwhile, Lance Westwood's life was veering off course in ways he couldn't have predicted. A sudden economic downturn, combined with some ill-advised investments, had left him scrambling to salvage several high-stakes projects. Calls poured into his office day and night, angry investors, anxious partners, and opportunists looking to exploit his vulnerability. For a man who had always reveled in control, the chaos was suffocating. He found himself lashing out at employees, snapping at waitstaff, and drinking more than usual. One afternoon, in the middle of an intense negotiation, Lance remembered Maribel's song. Despite the stress, the memory surfaced, temporarily easing the tension in his mind. He recalled the power of her voice and how it had silenced everyone in the restaurant. It annoyed him that he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he wanted to, in a twisted way. The memory brought him a sense of regret for mocking her, but his pride refused to let him acknowledge that he had been in the wrong. He shoved the thought aside and returned to barking orders at his assistant. Deals needed to be made. Empires had to be saved. He would not be undone by a moment of sentiment. On the day of Maribel's audition, she arrived at the Waldorf Astoria with her heart in her throat. The hotel's entertainment coordinator, a stern man named Victor Reynolds, greeted her in the grand lobby. He led her to a small stage, set up in one of the more intimate lounge areas, a place usually reserved for private cocktail receptions. "Let's see what you can do, Miss Flores," Victor said, his tone businesslike but not unkind. He handed her a microphone, then nodded to a hotel pianist who was ready to accompany her. Maribel inhaled deeply. She'd chosen a classic piece, At Last by Etta James, feeling that its soulful vibe would complement her contralto range. As the pianist began, she closed her eyes and poured everything she had into each note. In that moment, she envisioned herself no longer as a timid waitress, but as a vocalist deserving of the city's spotlight. When she finished, the acoustics of the intimate lounge let the last note linger tantalizingly. Victor, who had been taking notes on a clipboard, set his pen down. The small group of hotel staff, caterers, bartenders, even housekeeping personnel who had paused their tasks erupted into applause. That was splendid, Victor said, his face breaking into a grin. We'll be proud to have you perform here on weekends. Let's finalize the contract this week. Maribel exhaled, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. At long last, a door had opened a legitimate opportunity to sing regularly in one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels. News of Maribel's new gig spread quickly among the hotel staff, many of whom cheered for her success. Yet, her first official performance in the lounge still felt like a leap into the unknown. She spent the next few days selecting her set list, everything from jazz standards to modern ballads, and rehearsing tirelessly after her regular shift ended. The hotel purchased a sleek black gown for her, a symbol of her transition from waitress to performer. Finally, the evening arrived. The lounge was dimly lit by amber-hued sconces and a small chandelier, giving it an intimate warmth. Plush velvet chairs encircled low tables, and a steady stream of well-heeled guests filtered in, sipping cocktails and chatting in hushed tones. A group of business executives took seats near the stage, waiting for the show to begin. Maribel stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding. She glanced at the small audience, spotting a few familiar faces from the staff who had come to support her. The pianist gave her a reassuring nod, and then the music began. She opened with "The Nearness of You," her voice steady but tinged with adrenaline. As she sang, she noticed how conversation in the lounge subdued, how clinking glasses grew quieter. One by one, guests turned their full attention to her, enthralled by the authenticity and richness of her voice. A sense of profound pride and gratitude radiated from her core. For the first time in her life, Maribel felt like she belonged on that stage. Halfway through her set, Maribel spotted a figure stepping into the lounge. Dressed in an impeccable suit, with a face etched by stress, stood Lance Westwood. Her voice faltered for a second, but she recovered quickly, continuing her song without missing a beat. She tried to remain professional, focusing on her performance. Yet she could feel his gaze locking onto her as he made his way to the bar, ordering a drink. While she sang, her mind whirled with questions. Had he come here by coincidence, or was it intentional? She remembered the humiliating incident in the dining room, his mocking request, and how it had inadvertently led her to this place. She wondered if he harbored resentment or regret. The final notes of her song drew applause from the audience. She thanked them with a gracious smile. At the bar, Lance clapped slowly, wearing an inscrutable expression. When their eyes met, a palpable current passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey that had transpired since their last meeting. During her short break, Maribel moved to the backstage area to sip water and steady her nerves. One of the hotel staff quietly informed her that Lance Westwood had requested a meeting with her after the show. The pit of her stomach churned with both dread and curiosity. She thought about refusing, but a part of her wanted closure, some sense of resolution for the humiliations and revelations that had led her here. When Maribel finished her final song, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. The lounge manager, Victor, took the microphone to thank everyone for attending and to spotlight Maribel's new residency at the Waldorf Astoria. A few guests stood to congratulate her, shaking her hand and expressing their admiration. Among them was an older couple who mentioned that her voice reminded them of old Hollywood jazz clubs, a compliment that made her heart swell. As she slipped off the stage, she spotted Lance Westwood waiting by a secluded corner near a tall marble column. She took a moment to collect herself before approaching him. Up close, she noticed the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a subtle sign that his professional life was not as perfect as he liked to project. "That was an impressive performance," Lance said quietly, his tone much softer than she'd ever heard before. "You have real talent." Maribel crossed her arms, trying to maintain a cautious distance. "Thank you," she replied, her voice guarded. "Did you come here just to watch me sing?" Lance glanced at the floor, then back at her. "I had business at the hotel, and I heard they had a new lounge singer. To be honest, I was curious." His eyes flickered with something resembling remorse. "About that night in the restaurant, I realize I acted like a jerk. I wanted to apologize." Maribel exhaled slowly. This was the last thing she'd expected from him, yet it offered a chance to address the sting she'd felt. "I appreciate that," she said, not unkindly, but her voice carried the memory of the humiliation she'd endured. They moved to a quieter corner, away from the remaining guests. Lance placed his untouched cocktail on a nearby table and took a seat. Maribel followed suit, her posture erect with residual tension. She wasn't sure whether to trust this new, seemingly contrite side of him. "I'm not good at this," Lance admitted, rubbing his temples. "But let me be direct. I owe you more than just an apology. That night, I intended to ridicule you, and instead, I discovered your immense talent. It made me realize how easily I dismiss people's gifts just because I have money and power." Maribel studied him. "It was humiliating," she said, her words measured. "I didn't sing that night to impress you. I sang because I was given no choice, but also because it's the one thing in my life that gives me genuine purpose." He nodded, a shadow passing across his face. "I've been taught to see everything as a transaction," he said quietly, "but when you started singing, it felt different. It was like witnessing something pure, untouchable by money. Frankly, it shook me." They sat in silence for a moment, two very different worlds colliding under the soft lounge lighting. He was a man who had clawed his way to the top, losing pieces of his soul in the process, while she was an artist whose voice could stir the soul of even the most jaded listener. Finally, Lance inhaled sharply. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance to make amends." Maribel listened to his plea, unsure what form his amends could take. She remembered how, after her performance that night, her life took a turn for the better. She got the attention that led to her new singing contract. In a strange, roundabout way, Lance's cruelty had catalyzed her opportunity. Yet she also knew she could never condone how he had tried to humiliate her. "I don't know what you're expecting me to say," she replied honestly. "Your mocking opened a door for me, but it could have easily gone the other way." He nodded, swallowing his pride. "I've had some recent setbacks," he admitted, not elaborating on the details of his financial troubles. "Let's just say life has reminded me that I'm not invincible. You showed me something that night, real talent, real passion. If there's any way I can support that, I want to." Maribel searched his face. Could it be genuine remorse, or was he looking to assuage his guilt? She found his expression earnest, albeit tinged with desperation. A few beats of silence passed. "People are already helping me here, giving me a chance to sing regularly," she finally said. "I'm not sure there's anything I need from you." She paused, reconsidering. "But if you really mean what you say, there's something else you can do. Treat people better, all people, not just those who sing for you." Her words hung in the air, a small piece of advice that held weight beyond any transactional apology. Lance considered her words, nodding slowly. "I'll try," he said, "but I'd also like to help in a tangible way. If you ever need a sponsor, or if you want to record something, anything, please let me know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card made of thick, embossed paper. "This is my private line." Maribel accepted the card with a measured caution. She glanced at the fancy lettering, Lance Westwood, Westwood International Holdings. The phone number glowed discreetly in gold ink. "Thank you," she said, tucking it into her purse, though not entirely sure she would ever use it. They parted ways that night, on a note of mutual understanding, if not exactly friendship. Lance left the lounge, slipping into the back seat of a waiting town car, while Maribel stayed behind to bask in the afterglow of her successful performance. She had an odd swirl of emotions, relief, wariness, and a strange empathy for a man who seemed trapped in his own ambition. Over the next few weeks, Maribel's weekend performances became a hit among hotel guests. Word of mouth spread quickly, and more people came to hear the singing waitress turned lounge star at the Waldorf Astoria. Each performance strengthened her confidence, proving that her voice was more than just a pipe dream. It was something that could move others, something that could elevate her life beyond mere survival. And though Lance Westwood seldom came around, a small part of her remained curious about his ongoing journey and whether he truly would change for the better. Karma, however, wasn't done with Lance Westwood. One morning, a major deal he had pinned his hopes on collapsed unexpectedly, taking with it a substantial chunk of his fortune. Shareholders panicked, pulling out investments like dominoes. By noon that day, Lance had lost more than he'd ever thought possible in a single swoop. Desperation set in, accompanied by a sense of betrayal. Some of his closest associates scattered like mice fleeing a sinking ship. Faced with mounting debts, Lance had to liquidate assets. His penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park was listed, and he moved into a more modest condo. News outlets, always hungry for the downfall of the mighty, published unflattering articles about the self-made mogul who flew too close to the sun. As he scrolled through these headlines on his phone, Lance felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. He had thrived on public admiration, and now he was the subject of gossip and ridicule. In the midst of this turmoil, a glimmer of humanity fought to emerge within him. The hard lesson life was teaching him, the transience of wealth and the fragility of reputation, echoed. Maribel's words, "treat people better." He started with small acts, giving his assistant time off, paying his staff promptly despite dwindling funds, apologizing to some he'd wronged along the way. Yet, the path to redemption was far from clear, and each day he feared discovering a new debt, a new betrayal, or a new legal trouble lurking around the corner. Meanwhile, Maribel's star continued to rise. A local entertainment journalist attended one of her lounge performances and wrote a glowing review, calling her voice a powerful reminder of why live music remains enthralling in a digital age. Bookings for private events trickled in, and she even received an inquiry from a small jazz club in the East Village about a guest performance on a Friday night. Emboldened by these opportunities, Maribel decided to reach out to a local producer who specialized in indie jazz recordings. She had recorded a demo once before, but it was of poor quality and never circulated widely. This time, she wanted to do it right. The producer, impressed by her raw talent, offered a feasible rate for studio time. Yet, even with her growing popularity, Maribel's finances were still tight. The Waldorf Astoria gig paid better than waitstaff wages, but the cost of living in New York City remained punishing. Setting aside enough money for quality studio sessions seemed daunting. She considered her options, contemplating whether she should pick up additional shifts or even take a short-term loan. It was during this internal debate that she stumbled upon Lance Westwood's business card in her purse. The memory of their last conversation resurfaced. He had offered to help if she ever needed support. But what would it mean to ask him now, especially knowing his own financial troubles were all over the news? She hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Maribel spent several sleepless nights mulling over her growing desire to record a professional demo. She'd always believed in her gift, but New York City was as unforgiving as it was full of opportunity. Studio costs piled up, and every time she scrolled through her bank balance, the numbers seemed to mock her dream. Still, a tiny spark of hope refused to die out. In the back of her mind, she kept recalling the crumpled business card with Lance Westwood's private number, a man she never thought she'd speak to again, yet who had pledged his support if she ever needed it. Finally, in a moment of bold resolve, she retrieved the card from the bottom of her purse and dialed the number. Each ring felt interminable, her heart pounding with both anticipation and dread. She half expected an automated message, or, worse, that the number might be disconnected given Lance's financial troubles. But after the third ring, a familiar voice answered. "Maribel," he said, sounding both weary and genuinely surprised. I wasn't expecting your call. How are you?" She paused for a beat, caught off guard by the warmth in his voice. Then, remembering why she had dialed in the first place, she explained her predicament, how she was poised to take the next big step in her singing career, but lacked the funds to secure the studio time she desperately needed. Her voice wavered slightly when she mentioned that she knew he wasn't in the best financial shape either, referencing the countless headlines announcing his downward spiral. She almost stopped herself, thinking it might be too much to ask of a man already under siege. "Don't," Lance cut in, his tone gentle but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but I meant what I said when we last spoke. I'm hardly in a position to hand out blank checks these days, but I do still have connections, some good ones actually. Let me see what I can do. We'll figure this out." Relief and uncertainty washed over Maribel in equal measure. They arranged to meet at a cozy midtown cafe rather than a luxury restaurant or upscale lounge. When she entered, she spotted Lance seated at a small wooden table by the window. He looked thinner, his sharp features more pronounced. Gone were the flashy cufflinks and high-end watch. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, making him appear more grounded, almost like any other New Yorker grabbing a quiet coffee. After brief pleasantries, Lance handed Maribel a folded piece of paper with a studio name and contact information in Brooklyn. "The owner owes me a favor from some investments I made in a small music label a while back," he explained, his voice calm and measured. "They'll give you a discounted rate. I'll pitch in to cover whatever else you need. Don't worry about paying me back. Think of it as my way of helping you share that voice with the world." Maribel's eyes sparkled with gratitude. She clutched the paper as though it were a precious promise. Just a few months earlier, she would have scoffed at the idea that Lance Westwood, of all people, could be her lifeline to a professional recording session. Yet here he was, humbled by circumstance, but still determined to do right by the person he had wronged. As they continued talking, Maribel felt a cautious hope building inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this unlikely alliance could help them both carve a better path forward, one defined less by old wounds and more by the possibility of genuine transformation. Maribel felt an unexpected swirl of gratitude and compassion the moment she saw Lance reach into his pocket to hand her a neatly folded slip of paper. It struck her how drastically his demeanor had shifted. The once overbearing aura of a man who believed himself above everyone else had softened into a subdued humility. Gone were the flashy cufflinks and the perpetual smirk. His suit, still well-tailored, appeared more understated, as if he'd deliberately chosen something that wouldn't scream for attention. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, the remnants of sleepless nights spent grappling with financial collapse and wounded pride. The piece of paper he gave her contained the address and contact information of a recording studio in Brooklyn, a modest place, he'd explained, but one run by genuine music enthusiasts. "They'll give you a discounted rate," he said. "I'll cover whatever else you need. And don't worry about paying me back. Consider it an investment in a talent that deserves to be heard." Maribel held the paper gingerly, as though it were a delicate key to an uncharted future. A rush of conflicting emotions coursed through her. Here sat the man who had once humiliated her in front of his entourage, using her to entertain them like a court jester. Yet he was also the same man who had inadvertently set her on a course to fulfill her deepest passion. The contrast between who he'd been and who he appeared to be now was stark, almost disorienting. "Thank you," she managed, her voice wavering with relief and lingering caution. "You really don't know how much this means to me. I've been saving up for studio time, but New York is, well, it's expensive. And if this deal works out, it'll be the first real step toward making a professional recording." A small, rueful smile appeared on Lance's face. "I do understand," he said softly. "New York can chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful. I learned that lesson the hard way." He took a sip of his coffee, wincing slightly at the bitterness. "But what I'm doing for you, helping you with the studio, is the least I can do. In a way, I feel like I owe you far more than just an apology or a financial favor. You showed me that money and power can't buy everything, least of all grace or true talent." They spent the next half hour delving into details, which songs Maribel planned to record, the possibility of collaborating with local jazz musicians, and how best to pitch the demo to small labels once it was finished. Lance's practical suggestions were rooted in the same sharp business mind that had once made him a formidable real estate mogul, but now he offered them in service of someone else's dream rather than his own ambition. It felt, to both of them, like a healthier, more earnest channeling of his abilities. When the conversation lulled, Lance glanced down at his hands, which were clasped tightly in front of him on the table. "I know I can't undo what I did that night," he murmured. "It wasn't just arrogance, it was cruelty. And I'm ashamed of it." Maribel watched him carefully, weighing whether his remorse ran deeper than mere words. The sincerity in his eyes suggested it did. "You've already taken big steps," she said. "Doing this for me, acknowledging how you acted, that shows growth. I'm not saying everything's forgiven and forgotten, but I do see the effort you're making." He exhaled slowly, a silent expression of relief. "I'd like to believe I'm a different person now, or at least on the path to becoming one." Maribel offered him a gentle smile. "Maybe that path isn't a straight line, but it seems like you're moving in the right direction. That's what matters. And I truly appreciate your help. This chance to record professionally is a dream come true for me." They rose from the small wooden table in the cafe, the afternoon light filtering through large windows and illuminating the promise of new beginnings between them. The handshake they shared this time was different from the night in the lounge. It felt more like an accord, a mutual recognition that they were both benefiting from an extraordinary twist of fate. Where once there had been scorn and fear, there was now a tentative but genuine respect. Their unlikely alliance was a testament to how life's sharpest detours can lead to unexpected bridges. Maribel was on the verge of realizing a lifelong dream, and Lance found the beginnings of redemption he never realized he needed. The two parted with a shared sense of hope, fully aware that nothing would ever be quite the same again, nor would they want it to be. And so our tale comes to a close, yet it's only the beginning for Maribel and Lance. She'll go on to record her demo, poised to share her voice with a world that once seemed too vast and indifferent. He'll continue rebuilding from the rubble of his old empire, armed with a renewed sense of empathy and humility. In a twist of destiny, one humiliating dare sparked a transformation in both of their lives, proving that even the darkest intentions can inadvertently give birth to something beautiful. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share it with anyone who loves a good dose of karma, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic tales and inspiring journeys. By supporting our storytelling, you help keep these narratives alive and empower countless dreamers to keep fighting for their moment in the spotlight. Thank you for being a part of our community. Until next time, end of story.